Welcome to our conversation today on advancing climate equity through place-based collaboration. I'll just quickly introduce myself. My name is Prachir Pasricha. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm a manager of communities on the Community Climate Transitions and Communities Building Belonging teams at Tamarack. And I'm joining you all from Lenape-Hoking, which is the ancestral and current lands of the Lenape peoples. And I'll pass it over to my colleague Laura to introduce herself and offer a land acknowledgement and get our conversation going with a check-in question. Over to you, Laura.
Thanks, Prachir. And once again, welcome everyone to today's webinar on advancing climate equity through place-based collaboration. For those who don't know me, I'm Laura Schnurr, Director of Community Climate Transitions with Tamarack Institute. And I co-authored the 10 guide that we'll be launching today alongside Prachir, and we will be co-hosting this conversation. Ce webinaire se déroulera en anglais, mais nous sommes heureux de recevoir vos questions en français ou en anglais et nous pourrons les traduire si nécessaire. Donc, bienvenue aux francophones. I'm calling in today from Tiohtià:ke, colonially known as Montreal, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka peoples. And I want to share a brief story about this place and how it connects to the topic we're exploring around place-based partnerships and collaboration. So in 1701, following a prolonged period of conflict, the Great Peace of Montreal Treaty was signed here between New France and 40 Indigenous groups in Central and Eastern North America. Weeks of negotiations culminated in the signing of the treaty, which brought peace to the region for 60 years. So here in Tiohtià:ke, there is a history of Indigenous and non-Indigenous groups coming together across their differences around a shared goal. In this case, it was peace. And now we're going to fast forward more than 300 years to today, and we'll be looking at some current day examples of how place-based partnerships are accelerating action towards another shared goal, advancing climate equity. So before we dive into that, I'd like to invite everyone to introduce themselves in the chat. So please share your name, organization or affiliation, where you're calling in from, and if you like, what you're hoping to get out of today's conversations. So we'll take you can take a minute or two to do that, but in the meantime, we'll pass it back over to Prachir, and we'll share a little bit about this 10 guide that we've just launched before we move into conversation with our speakers.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Laura. We're really looking forward to getting into the topic of today's webinar, which is based on a publication, as Laura mentioned, that we just launched yesterday. For those of you who aren't familiar with 10 guides, these are Tamarack's most popular resources, and they provide a comprehensive resource on an overview of a given topic. And so they typically include 10 questions to assess readiness, 10 great ideas, 10 inspiring stories, 10 useful resources, and 10 ways to get started. And we'll be getting a bit more into each of these sections in a moment. But just highlighting that since January, we've been co-creating this guide's content with CCT's advisory group, which one of our speakers today is a part of, and gathering inspiring stories of communities across Turtle Island, two of which are represented by our other two speakers today. And we wrote this guide for a few reasons. One was that we wanted to complement the wealth of content out there on the technical aspect of advancing climate action, or the what, with guidance on how to do this work in a way that's just and equitable and community-led. So really looking at the how of the work. We also wanted to bring together mitigation and adaptation, as well as address other community priorities, just recognizing that both of these are key to addressing the climate crisis and that communities are grappling with other social, economic, and political issues. And finally, we wanted to provide a starting point for anyone in a community, no matter your role, whether you work in local government or are part of a resident-led group or own a small business. This guide can help you bring others into advancing climate equity in your community. Which brings us to the question, what is climate equity? And we get into this a bit in the guide's introduction, which also includes a definition of climate equity. But essentially, it recognizes that the climate crisis does not affect all of us equally. And whether that be based on race, color, gender, age, sexuality, national origin, ability, income, or the other aspects of our identity, each of us has experienced and do experience climate impacts in different ways. And so achieving equity in the context of climate action means recognizing and centering the needs of those groups that have been excluded or ignored or pushed out to the outer edge of a group, of a community, or of society, in how we mitigate and adapt to climate change. And we've found from over 3 years of supporting community-led climate action across Turtle Island that place-based collaboratives are essential to tackling the climate crisis. So these are groups of actors in a place, whether that place be a neighborhood or a town, a city, a nation, or a district, that bring together different sectors, as well as those who have firsthand experience of the impacts of the climate crisis in their community to advance mitigation and adaptation goals at a community level. And given that municipalities have influence over half of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions, and that more and more communities are experiencing extreme weather events related to climate change, I'm thinking most recently of those in Jasper who have been dealing with absolutely devastating wildfires in recent weeks. It's essential that our local contexts are ready to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And so with this in mind, we'll jump into a brief overview of some of the guide sections, but please feel free to take a deeper dive after today's webinar. Jamie has shared the links for both the English and French version in the chat. So we can jump to the next slide where we have the 10 great ideas that we featured in the guide. And these were co-created by the CCT team and our advisory group, which is made up of climate experts and practitioners who help guide our work. And so these ideas are sort of meant to capture the whole journey of taking climate action, beginning with creating a diverse roundtable of actors in your place, which can serve as the backbone structure for your work, all the way to thinking about the long-term viability, but from the very beginning, both in terms of the people and the financial resources that make your efforts possible. So we can just spend a few moments to take in these ideas, and then I'll pass it to Laura to speak to some of the inspiring stories and useful resources that we featured. But we'll just spend a few moments to take in these ideas. With that, I'll pass it over to you, Laura. And Lisa, thanks for the question. If we have a link for this resource, yes, we do. I think it was shared a bit above, but we can definitely share it again. Thanks.
There we are. Thanks, Jamie, for reposting. So next we'll move into the 10 inspiring stories that we explore in the guide. And this map really shows how diverse they are. Diverse in terms of geography, diverse in terms of the mix of urban and rural, and also the topics they cover. Each story is an example of at least 2 of the big ideas from that prior slide that Prachir shared. And some of these stories connect with many more than 2. These stories are also diverse in terms of where we're seeing leadership coming from. Leadership can come from diverse places, and sometimes it's the local government, other times it's community groups, First Nations, residents, students. A lot of these stories, there is a lot, or even all, there's that place-based partnerships and collaboration aspect, but often the original instigator is coming from a different place. And some of these stories are more focused on mitigation, others more on adaptation, yet many take this integrated and holistic approach across the 2. And they all apply an equity lens to climate action. So today we have speakers who will talk about the Edmonton and Montreal stories specifically, but you can learn more about all the others in the guide itself. So we do hope you take your time with it in the hours and days to follow. So there are 10 resources as another section of the guide. And this is a section where we dive into resources that we feel are useful for community change makers in doing this work, and that we have really heard from our members and learners that they love these particular tools, whether they're reports or more tools. So the ones on this slide are actually more tools. So there's the relatively new healthyplan.city tool around exploring equity in your built environment, 125 municipalities across the country. C40's Toolkit for Equitable Impacts, SFU Act's Low Carbon Resilience Tool to really bring together mitigation and adaptation, and Tamarack's Community Engagement Planning Canvas that so many of our members and learners have enjoyed working through and gotten a lot of clarity around their community engagement plans thanks to. And on the next slide, there are some helpful reports on topics including Indigenous resilience, community building, peer-to-peer community engagement, developing a common agenda for collective impact, taking climate action in small and rural communities, and integrating equity into municipal climate planning. So that's just a taste of what you'll find in the 10 guide. And again, do take your time with it after today's call. But now I'll pass it back to you, Prachir, to introduce our speakers and kick off the conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, Laura. With that, I'm really excited to introduce our speakers for today's webinar, who, as I mentioned, have been involved with the guide in one way or another, but also just bring so many perspectives and experiences related to advancing climate equity and to this conversation. And so I'll share a bit about each of them, but we'll drop their full bios in the chat, and we'll also start off with some introductions by each of them and sharing how their work relates to climate equity and or place-based collaboration. So on today's call, we have Kat Cadungog, who is on CCT's advisory group and is the executive director of Finance, Engage, Sustain, which is a youth-led, youth-serving organization committed to empowering youth and advancing a more inclusive, fair, prosperous, and sustainable future. We have Lylou Sehili, who is a community relations coordinator with Transition en Commun, which is advancing a socio-ecological transition in neighborhoods in Montreal, and is one of the initiatives featured in the 10 guide. And we have Heather Wheeliker, who is the current lead for Change for Climate at the City of Edmonton, where she works on both mitigation and adaptation efforts, and is also one of the initiatives featured in the guide. So welcome, Kat, Lylou, and Heather to today's webinar. We're grateful for your time and looking forward to the lessons learned and best practices and insights you'll share. So as I mentioned, we can start off by having each of you introduce yourselves and share a bit about the work you do, tying it back to climate equity and or place-based collaboration. So we'll start off with Heather and then go to Kat and then Lylou. Over to you, Heather.
Perfect. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in today's webinar. And of course, I go off script a little bit, but I'm Heather Wheeliker, and my role, as you said, is to lead Change for Climate. And so through that, we inform and educate about climate change and support and encourage residents to take action. I thought it might be important to provide just a little bit of context of where this Neighbouring for Climate program originated from. So Edmonton, the capital of Alberta, the traditional name of Edmonton is Amiskwishe Waskahegan, meaning Beaver Hills House. And this place was the traditional meeting ground for many Indigenous communities. As Edmonton's current population of over 1 million grows, the importance of community and being neighborly continues. So Edmonton is a city of seasonal extremes. We can reach above 35 degrees Celsius with 17 hours of light in the summer and colder than -40 and 8 hours of light in winter. The past number of years, like many places around the globe, Edmonton's experienced a lot of weather extremes, and what we call extremes now are becoming the norm. And so we need to prepare for that. So the city has a climate mitigation strategy, also an adaptation strategy, and goals and actions in both indicate that residents need to be involved in taking action. The adaptation strategy was presented to council in 2018. And fast forward to summer of 2022, I was asked to develop a community program to support the goals of the adaptation strategy. And my research had told me that given the prominence of disaster preparedness in climate adaptation, the program needed to involve neighboring and being neighborly. So I think most of us know the benefits of connecting with our neighbors are far-reaching. It's not just about building a sense of belonging and social connections, but it's also essential to building our climate resilience and disaster preparedness. We know that neighborhoods that sustain damage from extreme weather are better able to rebuild when residents have pre-established connections with their neighbors. We also wanted to ground this work in asset-based community development. So Neighbouring for Climate was designed to build off strengths for positive change. Each of us has something to offer. So to design the program, we put a call out to residents to see who wanted to co-design this with us. We ran workshops, and at the first one, community members told us they did not want another planning document. They just wanted to take action. So we asked them questions. What experience do you have with climate change? Who are your neighbors? What are the assets on your street? We were at the tail end of COVID and things were just opening up. So we brought residents together in virtual sessions and sent summaries out to those who could not or would not participate so that they could also contribute. And anyone not comfortable with technology, facilitators were there. We had lots of time for discussion and we ensured that all ideas were captured. And it became clear that there was not one audience that this needed to be for. The program needed to have an entry point for anyone and everyone in the neighborhood, not just a few climate enthusiasts. So we spent some time talking about who lives around us, how could we design something that worked for everyone, regardless of age, whether we are working or not working, volunteering or not, what our income levels are, families, singles, couples, languages spoken, cultural background, and so on. The citizens we met with described what the program needed to be or do, and that included it had to be action-focused, easy, tangible, inclusive, accessible. So Neighboring for Climate was the result of the workshops, and it was designed with an equity lens. The main pieces of the program include a guidebook, action cards, and an online hub where you can go for more information. The action cards are organized into 6 topics. It includes energy transition, and the colors make it easier to choose actions based on interests and passions. And the cards, they're intended so that you can sit down together at a kitchen table or a community event and read through bite-sized pieces of information so it's not too overwhelming. And once you know your neighbors, the options are endless. How you wish to implement the actions, which actions you choose, who leads what, it's all determined at the street level or within your building through conversations with neighbors. And in a nutshell, that's Neighboring for Climate, a program for everyone. It makes climate action feel more doable because we're all in this together.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that introduction, Heather, for you and for the work that you do. And of course, for those of you who are interested in learning more about Neighboring for Climate, it is one of the stories featured in the guide. So definitely encourage you to check that out. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Kat, just to introduce yourself and chat and share a bit about how your work relates to the topics of today's webinar.
Perfect. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. I love Neighboring for Climate. It's amazing what you learn when you actually talk to people. And I'm based in Calgary, Alberta, and recently, I think 2 days ago, we had our large hailstorm, and then my neighbors' friends are dealing with the impact of toonie-sized hail hitting their cars and smashing everything. So it's a good time to be neighborly for sure. So if you can bring that guide down south, that would be quite great, Heather. So I'm the Executive Director of Finance Engage Sustain, formerly known as Foundation for Environmental Stewardship. We are a youth-led, youth-serving organization. And what we do is that we redistribute funds to youth-led climate action throughout the entire country. What we find is that there's a critical underinvestment in youth-led climate work, despite young people being really at the forefront of innovation, of entrepreneurship, and really having a personal stake when it comes to the climate crisis. One thing that we like to think about too is that if you don't fund youth work, it really disrupts this talent pipeline. And by not funding youth work, what you're really doing is saying that if you're privileged, if you are part of an urban center, if you have access to these historical networks and you have a privilege to volunteer, those are the type of youth that are typically invited to the space versus equity deserving groups that typically can't compensate themselves, maybe don't have as robust of a network, are typically excluded from the space. So FES has always had a really strong equity lens when it's come to our regranting and our program development, especially because what informed the program is that from 2012 until 2019, well, I'm getting my dates mixed up now, is that we ran 3% projects. So we went to 420 different schools and rural, remote, Indigenous communities, just talking about climate action, getting young people engaged, and then getting them to start the projects. And the barrier each time was that there's not enough money, there's not enough support, there's not enough of a structure to help youth-led organizing throughout the country that's consistent and can kind of be I would say a pillar when it comes to creating connections between the institutional and the grassroots. So hence FES responded by developing the Youth Harbour and Now for Net Zero. So these are the 2 programs that we run now. FES runs Now for Net Zero, so I'll start with that project first. That's geared towards rural communities and specifically high schools, where we support place-based collaboration when it comes to high schools and energy projects, and really giving rural communities an opportunity to participate in climate action and climate work. And one of the really beautiful examples of this is that we supported a specific project in a rural community to build a net zero tiny home. And it's been so powerful in the community that Youth has been featuring it, and all this, because it's such a small school, students have been skipping class to help build this tiny home. And now they're bringing these lessons back home and teaching their parents about it. And they're already talking about all these cool features that they're going to embed into their homes in the future. So that's a really cool way to really talk about place-based collaboration and the power of community and those linkages in school and systems, and youth being the best messenger when it comes to what's actually accessible in terms of climate action. The Youth Harbour is what I call our spicier advocacy mobilization program, where we support a lot of groups working specifically to kind of change the culture, societal shifts, the political attitudes when it comes to climate action. And this is broken down into 4 different streams of funding, where we pool philanthropic funds and we redistribute it to youth-led climate activists with the support of an entire youth steering committee, kind of born out of different places on the spectrum of youth-led climate action. So the Youth Harbour has 4 different funds, one of them being Access. So this is specifically for equity deserving youth. A lot of times we ask equity deserving youth to participate in climate action, but they actually don't really have an avenue to go to workshops, learn more, go to a conference, go to these really important places to build up their skill set and their knowledge. So what we do is that we provide them funding to do that. Whether that's a workshop, whether that's a conference. We've sent people all across North America in order to be able to actually learn those skills and then go on to the next step, which is our assembly grants. So these are rapid response grants because a lot of youth are really powerful at responding to a moment, responding to a political issue. And youth are also really amazing at building community and providing community care. So we provide smaller grants for rapid mobilization. So for example, Fridays for Future in St. John's, just last year, they revitalized their climate strikes in September. And this was the first time ever that they could actually provide accessibility supports for people, that they could actually provide honorariums for Indigenous elders. And that enabled them to get hundreds of people on the streets and actually be able to compensate folks for their time. At the same time, we also have our action grants as well. So these are grants of $30,000 where we get to support young people to actually operationalize their work and experiment and try things out. This one is kind of our flagship fund within the Youth Harbour. And then finally, we have our Abundance Fellowship, where it's grants of $100,000 for equity deserving youth specifically, knowing that there's very intense barriers when it comes to compensation, as I mentioned, when it comes to support structures and skills building. And that's what we enable through FES. We host other programs because we know it's not just about throwing money at the problem. It's really about developing like a holistic network, really talking to young people about what their needs are, responding, changing, and even connecting to young people to the right connections to be able to scale and grow their work. So that's a little bit about FES and the work that we do.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kat. Yeah, FES is definitely addressing, I think, some of the critical gaps that we think about when we talk about climate equity and, youth and rural communities being just 2 of the many that come to mind. So thanks for sharing that. I'll pass it over to you, Lylou, to introduce yourself and how your work relates to climate equity and place-based collaboration.
Yeah, but my Wi-Fi, I don't know, maybe it's gonna shut down, but I'll try to come back really quick. So yeah, my name is Lylou Sehili, and I'm joining from Jajage, Montreal. I'm a community relations coordinator with Transition en Commun. Transition en Commun is a Montreal-based alliance with a diversity of actors from what we call the ecosystem of the ecological transition, but we're trying to add an equity lens to an ecological transition, because often people really, well, here at least, people really talk about the GES, yeah, I forget what the word is in English, but greenhouse gas
emissions, greenhouse gas.
Yeah, exactly. So we're trying to push a narrative where we we talk about how the climate crisis interacts with the housing crisis or with democratic issues. So that's a lot of the work we do. We work as well with the municipality, local tables, like neighborhood tables. I don't know if there's an equivalent outside of Montreal. We have resident groups. We have research chairs or centers. We have nonprofits, community organizations. So we have a variety of groups. So that asks a lot of mediation, a lot of diplomacy. So that's a lot of the work we do. And I think I'll try to keep it short because I think we're running a bit of late on time.
Thank you to each of you. There are some common threads that I was hearing throughout, and one of them was around being adaptive to local needs, and that's so critical when we do place-based work. Another was around belonging and connection, and that really important piece, which connects to a whole other area of work within Tamarack. And there's an effort right now around a national strategy for belonging, having a plan for belonging, and some great work happening there that I wanted to mention. And then a piece around making it fun too. And we heard that with Heather and the cards that you developed, and Kat with getting people involved in building the tiny home, and Lylou, yeah, there's so many great things happening here in Quebec. And Quebec has been such a leader in the socio-ecologique, the transition socio-ecologique, socio-ecological transition, really thinking about the integration across these areas. And just the neighborhood tables you mentioned, the table de quartier, is actually a unique model, a fairly unique model here in Quebec, that there are a lot of lessons we can draw for the rest of Canada. And Tamarack has have written some pieces on that in the past to really try to profile it and share it outside of Quebec, because it's relatively little known. So thanks for sharing a little about that, and we'll be diving deeper in later in the conversation. So Heather, I want to turn to you next and ask you, how have you found applying an equity lens to be important and beneficial to advancing climate action in Edmonton?
Thanks, Laura. I find that it's very rewarding once you understand how important it is to step out of your comfort bubble. Then the rewards are immense. Climate action, as we know, is not owned by anyone. It impacts everyone, but not necessarily everyone equally. So when we make an effort to include many voices, when we develop or offer programs, you just know that the results are going to be that much richer. In my experience, I often think I've got all the answers, but when you really listen and when you invite many voices into the room, you start to deepen your understanding of what people are interested in, what they're going to respond to, what they're seeking, how you might be able to support the efforts that they want to do. And so at the city, we have our climate goals, but in a city of 1 million people, the city staff can't do it all. So we rely on residents to step up and contribute. But as a city, what are we doing to support those residents in their efforts? I will add that I feel proud to work for an organization that not just supports, but also expects staff to approach our work with an understanding that one size does not fit all. And so do we still offer programs that fits the one size? Yeah, we absolutely do, but we also recognize it, and we work hard to develop additional programs that will support those who don't fit into the one size. And so I think the Neighbouring program, while it's pretty new, it was designed to meet the needs of many on many different levels. And I am personally committed to ensuring that we will continue to adapt the program as it's required to meet the needs of even more. And I do expect that we will hear more voices coming through asking us, do you have this in a different language? Can we take this and do this with it? So I think it's the adaptability is built into it so that it does meet the needs of many. And that's very exciting for me.
Thanks so much, Heather. I love what you said at the beginning of your answer, not owned by not owned by anyone, but everyone was responsible for it. And I think when we think about climate equity, when you were sharing just the piece around the adaptability, I think is so important, just recognizing the needs of different groups. And I think it's one thing to invite different groups into this work as a municipality, and it's another to meaningfully provide the opportunities and the resources to authentically engage with it. And I've really seen that in the work that the City of Edmonton has done through Neighbouring for Climate. I'd love to turn to you now, Kat, because I'm curious to hear what lessons you've learned about engaging with equity deserving groups through Finance, Engage and Sustain that you could share with the audience.
So many things per share, so many mistakes made and failing forward. And that's part of why we have these webinars, to share all the things. I'll try to break it down to 3 different thoughts. I would say the first one is, working with equity deserving groups, where you really have to budget the trust building and relationship building aspect into that. You can't just show up with a savior mentality and just say, hey, I'm ready to help you. That is actually quite like a harmful rhetoric to have, as if, like everybody else other than them can be saviors of their own kind of environment, not the fact that they've been systemically oppressed and treated as kind of second class for so long. So you really need to do budget trust building. What that means is, with Indigenous communities, are you showing up to like ceremony? Are you showing up to powwows? Are you showing up on their terms? And not just showing up as kind of like this performative act, like I'm here, I'm ready to help you, and really budgeting that into your project plans. Not just assuming they're going to be ready to help you and feeling frustrated when they don't. It's a big part of cultures to build that trust, to build that type of relationship first, so you can establish this type of relational accountability towards each other. And I think that's something that a lot of people, that when they want to work with equity deserving groups, they rush into that without actually thinking about how do you actually invest time, how do you actually invest resources and real money towards cultivating those relationships, whether that's in the form of honorariums, staffing, and doing this reflection internally on is if your organization actually ready what's your organizational readiness for building that type of trust with equity deserving groups? Would they feel safe interacting with your organization, the internal workings of it? And if you can't answer that question, I mean, it doesn't mean you can't interact with them, but I certainly think that challenges a stronger reflection about, what are your true intentions with working with equity deserving groups. I think another really interesting thing is that we need to, I think, better understand when we're working with equity deserving groups that they might have a different relationship with the problem that you're actually trying to solve in collaboration with them, and might have competing priorities. Especially an example of this is that we did some research on Chinese diasporic communities, and specifically with youth. When you're an international student, or for example, you're an immigrant, like what is your relationship with climate, and what are those competing priorities? What are the barriers to entry? And for example, when you're working with newcomers, I think specifically, what are newcomers' relationship with climate and land, knowing that they're an incoming settler to this land, and with newcomers and perhaps like even refugees, when this is something that we learned working with newcomer communities, when somebody's trying to get their PR, and there's certain point systems where they benefit from getting their permanent residency versus not, versus different opportunities where they might not quite as well benefit. That might be actually a huge barrier for them to participate in climate action, where the government itself scores certain opportunities better to actually achieve your permanent residency than other ones. So without that kind of full understanding of those barriers, it's actually really hard to interact, because those are some competing priorities with newcomer communities. And then finally, really understanding those barriers to entry, I think it was really important for us to understand those barriers, whether that was income, whether that was, whether that was trust that was broken from an earlier engagement. How do you seek to repair? And then trust comes after that actual repair. So I think it's a combination of really, making sure that you're intentional about building those relationships with equity deserving groups, understanding any type of competing priorities and kind of systemic barriers to participation, and understanding if there's anything that needs to be repaired first before you can kind of jump into that collaboration.
Thanks so much. It's great to hear. And indeed, FES is such a shining example of doing some of this work really well. But like you said, not always easy and not without challenges. And I heard the importance of doing that deep listening in community, learning, but also unlearning and challenging our own assumptions, and being ready and open to learning that, like, hey, maybe this isn't these are assumptions we're holding, and this isn't how it really is. So Really appreciate all that you shared. And turning to you next, Lylou, with Transition en Commun, you've engaged with many actors across Montreal in various neighborhoods, and you've been working, of course, with the City of Montreal and with residents and so many others. And curious what has been a benefit and a challenge of the collaborations you've built.
Yeah, well, for sure, one benefit is like the collective intelligence that we can gather. It gives holistic solutions to complex problems that that only one actor could not solve. So that's really a plus. It gives awesome results. Like we have I think I sent you the cadre de référence for reducing the amount of cars. Like we see motors, but it's not engines, but it's not only engines. But yeah, maybe you can share that. This is the result of a collaboration between people from the government, resident-led groups, research chairs, and like a lot of people. So it was a rich process, like a lot of back and forth, but very rich. So this is like we see it in all of our events or on everything we're working. Like we really see like we often reach goals that were further than what we expected. So that's really cool. It also builds an awesome network with a lot of entry points everywhere. So that's also something that's a benefit from this coalition. One challenge, however, is the fact that because we have various organizations, like I said earlier, it's a lot of mediation, a lot of diplomacy, because not all organizations have the same access to resources, not all the same priorities, like Kat said, not all the same agendas. So you have to deal with all of those needs. And so, yeah, it's a huge work of it's like coalition building work, but we don't see ourselves as a coalition. That's another thing. Like often when you have a coalition or an alliance, as we like to say, you try to take a stand in the public arena, but that has been a real challenge because when you apply an equity lens, sometimes you have to take stands in the public arena in order to like reach out to some groups or to show solidarity, and that's very important. However, when you have like the more groups you have, the more soft or diluted the stand becomes. And so that's like more of a paradox than a challenge, because we know we need to do it, we must do it to share our vision of a just transition, and etc. Like I don't know if there's an equivalent in English, but like popularize it, make it popular. I don't know. But yeah, so we have to do it, but then at the same time, it's like very arduous, and we're right now in the process of finding ways to do so in a ways that everybody feels comfortable in being in the alliance. So yeah, that's definitely a challenge.
Thanks for sharing that, Lylou. When you were talking about the benefits in terms of the diversity of thoughts, I think that resonates a lot with also what we share in the guide around taking climate action. And it reminds me of Kat's point where, if you have all of these groups around at the table, you're bringing different perspectives and sort of being made aware of things that you may not have thought of, or issues or considerations in terms of engaging with different groups and what their priorities might be. But at the same time, it is slow work and it is hard work. And I think that is what reminds me of that importance of the relationship building that Kat was speaking to earlier as well, to sort of help set the foundation for what those values of this group is and how that can inform some of those stances or decisions that the collective takes as a whole. And just to wrap up now with our questions, we'll go in the same order as we had our first question. So Heather, and then Kat, and then Lylou. Just on the note of the guide, we'd love to hear from each of you, which of the 10 ideas or the 10 ways to get started particularly resonate with you based on the work that each of you have done, and just to share a bit about why. So I'll start with you, Heather.
Great, thanks so much. And I just want to say, Lylou and Kat, thanks for sharing the work that you're doing and doing the work that you're doing. I've really enjoyed hearing more about it. In terms of the guide is amazing, and I can't wait to really dig into it. First off, the SMARTY goal caught my eye. I thought it was a typo. I'm like, smarty goals. Who did that? Some smarty pants out there. But of course, the I is added for inclusive and the E for equitable. So that really caught my eye. But I found the whole guide is just packed with great tips, bite-sized information. And the Get Started tip offer mentorship and training opportunities to support people who are new to climate action stood out for me in a couple of ways. First, it reinforced some of the program design principles of Neighbouring for Climate. We tried to make the program inclusive and easy for anyone to take action, so they don't have to be technical experts in order to meaningfully act on climate change. And secondly, it was nice to see this in writing on a personal level. 10 years ago, I worked with the U of A to co-establish a sustainability scholars program where the city or other organizations could hire and mentor a student enrolled in a master's or a PhD program, and they would be working on an applied research project. Some of these scholars have come back to work at the city full-time years later or work for other organizations where they were mentored. And others, I learned that were so highly influenced by the program, they switched their majors in the midst of their studies, gravitating towards sustainability. So you just never know the impact that you may have on someone. So I think mentorship and training is really important part of the work that we do.
For sure. Thanks for sharing, Heather. I think, yeah, we think often about how, the climate crisis can feel so daunting and how taking climate action can feel so daunting. And so definitely wanted to give a recognition of the importance of building that capacity and that awareness and that sense of empowerment and agency that I think is really important for anyone, no matter your role in your community, to have. So we can jump over to Kat. What are your thoughts on some of the content in the guide?
I love the guide. I really like the initial questions on to assess readiness. I think that's an important, whether you think you're doing equity deserving work or not, I think it's really key to be able to just do a reflection of your team and your organization to really understand, where you're at, where can you improve, what are things that we don't know. I think that's just a really amazing framework for that. The ideas that really stood out to me, I mean, all of them did, but I really love the concept of developing like shared measurement systems, because often, as we know, like the things that we don't measure, we're basically saying they don't matter. So if we're not measuring things around like equity, around justice, around all of these things, then it means that we're not taking enough time to care for the data and to actually reflect on the data. When you create a shared measurement system, I also see that as a shared accountability mechanism. When you don't actually publish what your goals are for equity, for inclusion, for diversity, for justice, you're saying that there's nothing that, these groups can actually hold you accountable to. And I think people's fear is saying something along the lines of like, well, if we're not sure that we can meet them, then like, why would we set these targets for ourselves? Because that makes us look bad. But I think instead what it should be framed as, it's like it's accountability mechanism. These are North Stars, these are milestones. This keeps us in check to make sure we're advancing to point B instead of even defining what that point B is at all, and being so afraid of failing that we don't even try to create the shared mechanism. And I think what keeps us accountable is the continuous learning and improvement, and having those kind of, this is, 0.7 and 8 kind of mixed together, but making sure you have those feedback mechanisms. So you not only have the quantitative data, but also the qualitative data, to ensure that your data is like community informed. Last thing that I'll say is the ways to get started is the asset mapping. There's no type of movement that is done alone. So to really understand the ecosystem, who's doing and what, so you're not duplicating efforts, that you're complementing each other, I think is really important. And trying to find out where everybody's at and seeing kind of the gaps that you can fill, where you can be the most helpful. Because again, I think jumping in without really having a good ecosystem understanding can be a little bit dangerous. And also, just maybe not as efficient. Like we would just want to have everybody participate in an equity-based future.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kat, for those reflections. I think we definitely saw the continuous learning and improvement and the shared measurement system in the same way, not only the internal purpose, but very much that external purpose as an accountability piece. So thanks for highlighting that. I'll pass it over to you, Lylou. Any thoughts on the 10 ideas, ways to get started, or anything else in the guide that you'd want to share with the audience?
Yeah, I want the ways to get started. Like there are 2 points that really grabbed my attention. The one on like building authentic relationships, like how Kat said earlier, like budgeting it and putting the time and effort that it takes. Like for us in Montreal with Commun, like there's a lot of time that it's just like building the community around it, like people getting to know each other and not just assuming that it's gonna like happen by itself and like you have to make it happen at least at the beginning. And the other point on the number 8 on the governance. So this is like for us it was a major key point because I think that like we had a fluid way like it was not established our governance, and it's been 2 years and we're still not in a final form. And I think that helped a lot because it having a fluid one, it allowed us to like change the structure, the governance accordingly to the needs of the alliance, and not being stuck in like whatever structure that we were used to. And I think it's since we're building something new, it's okay, and it makes sense that existing structure don't necessarily fit our structure. And like from a equity lens perspective, it's also like the colonial ways to organize ourselves, that the ones that are recognized by our institutions don't necessarily fit with the grassroots ways of organizing, or the community ways of organizing. So like yeah, I would say this point really grabbed my attention.
Thanks, Lylou. Yeah, I think that's so true. It's so tempting and easy, I think, to pick a structure off the shelf and apply it to your work. But I think that process of co-creating it, again, comes back to that sense of agency and empowerment, and everyone feeling like we're moving forward in a way that aligns with our values and our priorities and what we feel like we can each bring to the table, but also in a way that recognizes the different power and privilege dynamics in the different groups. So thank you for that. We're going to jump into a Q&A session now for a few minutes. I've seen a few questions in the chat, which we'll raise now, but as Laura mentioned in the chat, please feel free to add them in the Q&A box and vote on ones that are shared. It just helps us prioritize and see which ones might be of most interest to you. But we can start off with the ones that we have already. And I see a couple from Ian, and these are specifically for you, Heather, just around whether Edmonton's trying to encourage particular neighborhoods to take up the program, for example, are the ones that are more vulnerable or have higher energy poverty levels. And then just to build on that, are there any resources available to neighbor groups to help them implement the actions?
So my short answer is no and no. but I want to say more. So Neighbouring for Climate was just recently launched. We launched it in April, the first kit. So we piloted it last year, and now we're in the first full year of launching it. So our first goal is to really move the kits into the hands of what we're calling climate connectors anywhere across the city. But we will take stock at the end of this year, map out where those kits are going, and then over the coming years, we will have opportunities to begin to focus our efforts to ensure that underserved or vulnerable neighborhoods are supported with these tools. We don't have financial support at this time to help residents along with their efforts, but it doesn't mean that we never will. And as well, I think the way the Neighbouring for Climate program is structured, it's not so much relying on money, although I could be proven wrong on this. So I'm open to learning more. And I know, Kat, you've described that financial barriers definitely come up for you in the work that you do. So we'll be going in with our eyes and ears open to see what it is that we need to do to better support residents to take action at a neighborhood level or within their buildings in which they live.
Awesome. Thanks, Heather. Yeah, I think that's a example of that continuous learning and improvement brought to life. So thank you. I see a question from Savannah, which is, have you found pathways to reaching out to indirect community and municipal groups or efforts that are doing work that builds adaptive capacity and bringing them into the climate action space, particularly from a place of empowerment and equity? Just noting that Savannah's work focuses on highlighting social enablers that build climate resilience, but they're not always explicitly climate-centered. So I'll just let it open up. Well, before opening it up, I'll just note, Savannah, that I think the story in the 10 guide on the work in Ottawa would be of real interest to you, just of how they've been working to bring together organizations that are doing work on social issues and social inclusion with organizations that are sort of explicitly climate centered, just because they've recognized the need to sort of adjust the messaging and the programming in a way that addresses the needs of those groups that are doing work around social inclusion. So I'll just flag that first, but I'll just open it up now to the group as well if you have any thoughts on that question.
We did like I really like your question because it's a process in which we've learned a lot, because I think a lot of the initiators of Transition en Commun were really climate centered, and then met a lot of people who are more of a social enablers, how you call them. But however, I don't think our goal right now is to, maybe before it was to like bring them into like being more climate centered, but we realized maybe it was not necessary because they were still doing the work that was needed. And actually we took like the climate perspective and brought it more to a social perspective. Like if people are building resilience within their community, well, it means they are more resilient if there's a heat wave or floods or whatever. So we've been working a lot on this issue with Direction Régionale de la Santé Publique, so like the health system in Montreal, and like pinpointing, like mapping the community assets that can lead to climate resilience. But yeah, I don't know if I would say that the ways that we found to reach those people is like how we said earlier, to like actually meet those people and not necessarily putting our needs like that are maybe more climate centered, but just like asking them what their needs are, and then you just realize that maybe those needs meet, and you don't necessarily have to like they have to come our way or we have to go their way, but we can maybe just work together with a shared goal. So yeah, maybe that's not a great answer, but that would be my answer.
No, that's really helpful, Lylou. And I think that aligns well with what we've heard from some of the other communities that we feature in the guide and the stories, like just that idea around if they're doing the work, that's what matters. Like I'm thinking of Transition Salt Spring, which is doing work in Salt Spring Island in BC. And one of the lessons that they learned is that it's always not necessary that you have to position the work you're doing in the lens of climate action. They found that residents were really passionate about food security, emergency preparedness, waste reduction, and all of these, of course, tie back to the climate crisis. And so just sort of recognizing what they're bringing up and how that's relating to the work of climate action. So definitely resonates. Then we'll just jump into some closing announcements. And before that, just want to thank all of the panelists, Heather, Lylou, and Kat, for all of the insights and wisdom you've shared with us. I feel like there's been so many perspectives and experiences that are represented across this panel. And I think that really aligns with the ethos of the guide on, place-based collaboratives and recognizing the diversity of groups that are needed at the table to advance climate equity. So with that, I will pass it to Laura to close us out.
Yeah, thank you, Prachir, for co-hosting this together. Huge thank you to Lylou, Kat, and Heather for joining and sharing so much wisdom with everyone on the call. And of course, huge thank you to all the participants who joined us today, took time out of your day, middle of summer, truly. And it's gorgeous out here. So hopefully everyone can sneak out for a walk after or something, but glad you could tune in. And just moving into a few quick announcements. So our colleague Jamie did put the survey in the chat, feedback survey. We'd love to hear what you thought of today and ideas for future webinars you'd love for us to host. There's also Engage Fest that we want to share a little about. So we have our Tamarack wide national gathering happening October 29th and 30th. And it's taking place virtually with some in-person meetups in some communities across the country. So hope to see you there. There's a QR code, and we'll get the link in the chat for you as well, so that you can hopefully join us for that. And this is the first time we're doing like a Tamarack-wide event that replaces the events we used to do, like specific around climate and poverty and belonging and youth. And so we're bringing it all together, which is fun. And it really speaks to the things we've been talking about today, about these issues are not happening in silos. They can't be addressed in silos. And so we really want to bring more connections across our network of members and learners and have them cross-pollinate, let's say. So that's Engage Fest. And then we also have an upcoming 4-part webinar series that's taking place from this October to January around overcoming some of the challenges and barriers in local climate action. And that's called From Planning to Implementation, Overcoming Challenges in Local Climate Action. And we hope to see you there. We're diving into a number of different barriers. There's the link in the chat. Thanks so much, Jamie. Looking at some of the social, technical, political, institutional, and other barriers to getting to action and to implementation. And then there's also other upcoming webinars. We host weekly webinars here at Tamarack, and so we hope to see you for a future one. So that's it for today. Thanks again, everyone, for being here, and we'll send out the recording and resources in the coming days to everyone who's registered.